Hello, students. Welcome back to your history class. I am Mrs. Janisha, and we are doing Chapter 10 Displacing Indigenous People. Today, we'll start with Canada. The timeline of Canada. The French treaty with the natives of Quebec was made in 1701. Then the Quebec started to be conquered by the British people in 1763. 1774, the Quebec Act passes, and 1791, Canada Constitutional Act is made. 1781, Britain recognizes USA as an independent country, and 1783, British gave Midwest to the USA. So they return it. Let's talk about Canada and USA. The countries that are known as Canada and United States of America, they both came into existence at the end of the 18th century, and the in, uh, French later English occupied area of North America became Canada. So the area that was occupied by the British and French started to be named the area that they were occupying in the North America became Canada, and in English occupied area of USA of North America became USA. The British people that were occupying the area of North America, that became USA. But French were the first ones to, and the area that was occupied by the French became Canada. Large areas were acquired by the USA by purchase. So USA people, the English people also bought lots of areas. Okay, so from France, it bought the Louisiana Purchase. That means they bought Louisiana from the French people. They purchased Alaska from the Russian people, and from Mexico, they that is southern USA, they got the land by a war. They fought and they took Mexico, the land. Okay, now let's talk about the slavery in USA. There was a civil war in USA between 1861 and 1865. In the war, so in 1861 to 65, there was a war between the states that wanted to retain slavery, that means the ones that wanted slavery, and then there were some states that were supporting the abolition of slavery. The southern states, they supported slavery because it was dominated by the agriculture and plantation, and they needed slaves to run their businesses. And the northern states, which did not depend on plantations, they were against slavery and they wanted to abolish it. Finally, the northern states won, and in 1865, slavery was abolished. But it was only in the 20th century that the African Americans were able to win the battle for civil liberties, and the segregation between white and non whites in school and public transport ended. Canada, as Confederation of Autonomous State, which it got in 1867. In 1763, Canada had been won by the British after the British had a war with the France. And the French settlers, they repeatedly demanded autonomous political status. In 1867, this problem was solved by organizing Canada as a confederation of autonomous states. So, confederation of autonomous state means uh, a union of sovereign states, and the stress is laid on the autonomy of each constituent body, and federation implies a union of states in which the stress is laid on the supremacy of the common government. So confederations are basically voluntary association of independent states that, to secure some common purpose, agree to certain limitations on their freedom of action, and they establish some joint machinery of consultation or deliberation. So, because the French settlers were repeatedly demanding autonomous political status, they finally, in 1867, Canada was organized as a confederation of autonomous states. So, in the USA, the settlement started to expand, and the natives were induced or they were forced to move after signing treaties that sold off their land. And the prices that they were paid for the land was very low. There were instances when the American, which was a term used to mean the European people of the USA. American is actually the term used which indicates the European people of the USA, not the native people. Okay, there were instances when the Americans treated them by taking more land or paying less than the promised amount. Now, over here, the problem was that even the high officials they found nothing wrong in depriving the native people of their land. The natives were pushed westward and the natives were locked off in small areas called reservations, which often was the land with which they had no earlier connection. The US Army crushed a series of rebellions from 1865 to 1890. In Canada, there were armed revolts by the Métis between 1869 and 1885. Let's look at the Cherokee tribes issued, which came in the USA, Georgia. In 1832, an important judgment was announced by the US Chief Justice John Marshall. He said that the Cherokees were a distinct community. This is the Chief Justice of USA. He said that Cherokees were a distinct community occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia had no force and they had sovereignty in many matters. But the US President Andrew Jackson he refused to honor the Chief Justice judgment. He ordered the US Army to evict Cherokees from their land and drive them to the Great American Desert. So he told the US Army that this is not true and I'm not going to acknowledge it. So I want you all to drive Cherokees away from their land, remove them from their land, and take them to the Great American Desert. Of the 15,000 people who were forced to go, over a quarter died along the Trail of Tears. Okay, so along a quarter died, and that area, this stretch is called the Trail of Tears. Europeans' justification and rationale for taking the land of native people. So, why did the Europeans feel it was okay to deprive the native people of their own land, and why was it okay to cheat them? Why? What was the thinking of the Europeans? Indians under British rule, taxed arbitrarily, seen not as equal. Okay, so why were the Indians under British rule? We were taxed, we were not seen as equal, and the reason, the rationalization for it, the justification that the British people gave was that we were not ready for responsibility of representative government. Natives in America and Australia were not seen as citizens and they were not considered equal. And the reason, the rationalization is that primitive, as in no settled agriculture and provision for future or towns. So, according to them, there was no primitive need, there was no primitive for them to be considered as equal. African slaves in America, they were denied personal liberty and they were also not considered as equals. The natives did not deserve to occupy the land which they did not use to the maximum. They were denied personal liberty and they were not considered equal because slavery is a part of their own social system because they felt that the black people are inferior and so they deserve to become slaves, like it is a part of their system. The natives did not deserve to occupy the land which they did not use to the maximum, was one of the thinkings. Then the natives are lazy and they do not use their craft skills to produce any goods for the market. So, for example, if you're an artist who likes to paint for your own house, or your mother is a fantastic cook, but she doesn't want to cook for a restaurant, or she doesn't want to run a business, she just wants to cook to feed you all, then suddenly they are lazy because they're not using the craft skills to produce goods for the market. Then the next was the natives are not interested in learning English. They are not dressing correctly. Dressing correctly means dressing like Europeans. They deserve to die out, was their argument. A visiting Frenchman wrote, "Primitive man will disappear with the primitive animal." The gold rush in the USA. In 1840, traces of gold were found in the USA in California. This led to a gold rush where thousands of eager Europeans hurried to America in hope of making a quick fortune. This led to the building of railway lines across the continent, for which lots of Chinese workers, thousands of Chinese workers were then recruited. The USA's railway was completed by 1870 and the railways in Canada was completed by 1885. Andrew Carnegie, who was a poor immigrant from Scotland, he became one of the first millionaire industrialists in the USA, and he said that the old nations creep at a snail's pace and the republic thunders on at the speed of an express. That was his observation. Industrialization in North America. In North America, industries developed for a different reason. Number one was to manufacture railway equipment just so that rapid transport could link different and distant and remote places. To produce machinery which would make large scale farming easier. These were the two main reasons why industrialization developed in North America. Industrial towns grew and factories multiplied both in the USA and Canada. In 1860, the USA had been underdeveloped. In 1890, it was the leading industrial power in the world. Large-scale agriculture also expanded. Vast areas were cleared and divided up into farms. By 1890, the bison had almost been exterminated, and 1892, the USA's continental expansion was completed. The area between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans were now divided up into states. And within a few years, USA was now setting up its own colonies. That means USA people were now living in Hawaii and the Philippines. And it then became an imperial power. Canada, 1837, the French-Canadian Rebellion. 1840, Canadian Union of Upper and Lower Canada. 1859 is the Canada's Gold Rush. 1867 is the Confederation of Canada. 1869 to 1885, Red River Rebellion by the Mets in Canada. 1876, Canada's Indians Act. 1885, Transcontinental Railway links East and West Coast. USA. 1803, Louisiana is purchased from France. 1825 to 58, natives in the USA are moved to reserved lands. 1832, Justice Marshall's judgment. 1849 is the American Gold Rush. 1861 to 1605, we had the American Civil War. Sorry. 1865 to 1890, American Indian Wars. 1870, Transcontinental Railway. 1890, the bison gets exterminated in America. And 1892, end of the American frontier. Constitutional rights. The democratic spirit, which has been the rallying cry of the settlers in their fight for independence in the 1770s, this was again the monarchies and the aristocracies of the old world. Their constitution included the individual's right to property, but both democratic rights and the right to property were only for the white men. Democratic is the right to vote. Daniel Paul, a Canadian native, pointed out in 2000 that Thomas Paine, the champion of democracy at the time of the War for American independence and French Revolution, used the Indians as models of how society might be organized. So, the democratic idea was actually taken from the native people, and this was pointed out by Daniel Paul. He was a Canadian native, and he pointed out that the way the society should be organized is being taken by us. He used this to argue that the Native Americans set an example. They sowed the seeds for the long drawn out movement towards democracy by the people of Europe. So he's trying to tell that we were the one who set the example. The winds of change of America in favor of natives. How did things change? Here, the word Indian means the natives of America. In 1928, Lewis Merriam wrote about the backwardness of native people in his book, The Problem of Indian Administration. Then, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, it gave natives in reservation the right to buy land and take loans. In 1950 and 1960, the US and the Canadian governments thought of ending all the special provisions for the natives in the hope that if we end the special provisions, they will join the mainstream and they will adapt the European culture. In 1954, the Declaration of Indian Rights, which was prepared by them, and a number of native people accepted citizenship of the USA on the condition that the reservations would not be taken away from them and their traditions would not be interfered with. In Canada in 1982, the Constitution Act accepted the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the natives. Today, it is very clear that people of both countries are able to assert their rights to their own culture. Australia. Talking about Australia, the Aborigines began to arrive on the Australian land around 40,000 years ago. They came from New Guinea, which was connected to Australia by a land bridge. 1606, the Dutch travelers see Australia. 1642, Tasman land on the island, which is later named Tasmania. 1770, James Cook reaches Botany Bay and he names it as New South Wales. 1788, British penal colony was formed and Sydney was found. Talking about the native people or the Aborigines in Australia. In the late 17th century, there were between 350 to 750 native communities in Australia, each with their own language, and even today, 200 of those languages are still spoken. Indigenous people lived in the north and they were called the Torres Strait Islanders. And the term Aborigines is not used for these uh, people because these people are believed to have been migrated from elsewhere and they belong to a different race. Together, these people make up for 2.4% of Australia's population in 2005. Australia is a sparsely populated country, and most of the towns are along the coast. The central region is an arid desert. Captain James Cook, who was a British explorer, he reported that the natives are friendly. Let's look at the encounters between Europeans and Australian aborigines. Captain Cook was then later on killed by a native, but not in Australia, but he was killed in Hawaii. This single act was later used by the colonies to justify other act of violence towards other people. Aboriginal production was dramatically disturbed by the British presence. The arrival of thousands of hungry mouths, but unprecedented pressure on local food resources, large scale destruction of sacred places, strange violent behaviors towards the land, the newcomers seemed to knock down trees without any reason. Nearly 90% of natives died by exposure to germs, by the loss of their lands and resources, and in battle against the settlers. Most of the early settlers were convicts who had been deported from England when their jail term ended, they were allowed to live as free people in Australia on the condition that they did not return to Britain. They felt no hesitation about even ejecting the natives from their own land. The economic development of Australia under the European settlements. Vast sheep farms, mining stations, vineyards, and wheat farming were established. These came to form the basis of the country's prosperity. When the states were united, it was decided that a new capital would be built for Australia, and one of the name was Wool Wheat Gold. Ultimately, it was called Canberra, which is a native word meaning a meeting place. Natives were employed in the farms under harsh conditions, and it was only a little different from slavery. Look at the development of Australia. 1850, self-government was granted to Australian colonies. 1851, Chinese coolie immigration, which was stopped by a law in 1855. 1851 to 1861, gold rushes in Australia. 1901, formation of Federation of Australia with 6 states. 1911, Canberra established as capital. And 1948 to 1975, 2 million people, 2 million Australians, 2 million Europeans migrate to Australia, which was the White Australia policy. There was a government policy that kept the non-white people out of Australia. Till 1974, such was the fear for dark people from South Asia or Southeast Asia that they could migrate to Australia in large numbers. And so the Chinese immigrants, they provided cheap labor, but later on, the government it banned all the non-white immigrants. What were the winds of change in Australia in favor of the natives? In 1968, people were electrified by a lecture given by the anthropologist W.E.H. Tanner, which was entitled The Great Australian Silence. This lecture was about the silence of the historians about the Aborigines in Australia. From 1970, there was an eagerness to understand natives. Henry Reynolds wrote a book, Why Weren't We Told? And he condemned the practice of writing Australian history as though it had begun with Captain Cook's discovery. Since then, university departments have been instituted to study native cultures. Galleries of native art have been put up. Museums have been enlarged to incorporate dioramas and imaginatively designed rooms explaining native culture. Natives have also begun to write their own life histories. From 1974, multiculturalism has been the official policy in Australia, which gave equal part respect to native culture and to many different cultures of immigrants from Europe and Asia. Terra nullus means belonging to nobody, and the government termed the land of Australia as Terra nullus. Children of mixed blood were forcibly captured and separated from their native relatives. While let's look at the timeline. The white Australian policy ends in 1974 and Asian immigrants are now allowed entry. 1992, the Australian High Court declares that terra nullius was legally invalid and recognizes the native claims to land from before 1770. 1995, the National Inquiry into Separation of Aborigines and the Torres Strait Islander children from their families, and a National Sorry Day as an apology to the children who were lost from 1820 to 1970. So, with this, children, this is all about this chapter. We've completed this chapter. We'll move on to the next chapter. With this, I end today's class. Stay home, stay safe, take care, keep learning. Thank you.